Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your presence at the talk today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kyle Searles. I think you probably all know him since you're all from ELF. Kyle just received his MA in TESOL in September, so congratulations. He's now a master, as I will show you momentarily. He's currently teaching 3 courses at Mel, and he's also taught English as a foreign language in Argentina and South Korea. He's certified to teach ESL and Spanish in Wisconsin, or not in Minnesota, right? Not yet. Yeah. Working on it. Yeah. And he's really interested in second language acquisition and learner identity and learner agency, which I'm really excited to hear about today. The title of his talk is Making the Most of It, Exploring Learner Agency in a Referential Communication Task Sequence. And before I hand over the floor, I forgot to plug our next series of talks. So I think we're featuring 2 more students from the MA TESOL program. I might be wrong about that. So on Tuesday, November 1st is our next talk. Oh no, it's Bethany and Michael are going to be presenting their survey research. And then on November 8th, we're having Darren Lescott, MA and TESOL student. Darren, you're presenting next. Excellent. And then we also are going to be advertising soon a talk on Thursday, November 10th, with some guest scholars who we're co-sponsoring that with the linguistics program. And they're also going to be doing a workshop on Friday, November 11th. So that's coming down the pipeline next to CARLA. Okay, Kyle.
All right. Great. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Paisani. So welcome, everybody. I'll come closer to where the action is here. It's good to see you all here. Thanks for making time in your busy schedules to join us. So yeah, I'm very excited to share this research that I've done, my Plan B study, as was just introduced, which came as it resulted from an SLA course study that began about a year ago. So this is sort of the closure for this process. Possibly, this could result in another presentation, but I like to think of this in some ways as a year to mark closure for me. Okay. So today I hope to just summarize the study for you as we're looking at learner agency in this context. And after I go about summarizing and present what I found in this case study, I'd like to have a discussion about some of the pedagogical implications. So, let's get started. I know it's it's quite the intimidating title, perhaps. This all came about looking at the referential communication task. This comes from, it's up on the CARLA site, in fact. There's a question and retell task sequence. And so when I was in my SLA class, I was trying to develop a research question to look at questions, language acquisition and question sequences. So it was kind of my first crack at doing this kind of a study. And so I used a series of pictures that tell a story, and the learners have to ask questions to understand what's going on, to get the events of the story, and then later they have to retell that. So I provide linguistic data in response to the questions. In my study, there are 2 learners who participated, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So the incongruities of a common task. One participant I've given the name Roy. This is what happened. R is for Roy, I is for the interviewer, myself. So given this picture here, Roy says, but her mother looks angry? Yes. Why? Her mother is angry because something that happened to the cake. Oh, okay, got it. So it's nothing related to the cat? Well, the little girl is trying to say that the cat did something to the cake. Oh, okay, got it, thank you. And is mother trying to punish her daughter? Yeah, kind of, because she's telling the little daughter to stay in the apartment. Okay, and do you know who did something wrong to Cake, cat or daughter? This is what happened in this slide for Roy. This is how he approached. My other participant, Unji, starts off, why does she is angry, the mother? Oh, the mother is very angry at her daughter because of something that she did. What she did? Well, the daughter says that she didn't do anything, but the mother thinks she did something very naughty. Got it. Do you want to ask anything else? Okay. So just looking at the two interactions here, I noticed that there's something interesting going on beyond just the kinds of questions that are asked in terms of the form, the grammatical form. That's interesting too. We have different complexity maybe in the question types, but there's also a concern for referential precision on the left and not as much on the right. There's a persistence on the left. There's a different engagement with the interviewer here. Okay, and so I found this very interesting. The study that I'm presenting takes a look at this interest through the lens of agency. Okay, inspired a lot by the difference between task and activity. So Coughlin and Duff did a study in '94 where they distinguished these two terms, right? So task is the behavioral blueprint for the interaction. Activity is the behavior that is actually produced. Okay. It's important that participants have their own objectives that are not always the same as the objectives of the researcher. This brings us to Yule on referential communication tasks. So he defines referential communication as the term given to communicative acts generally spoken, in which some kind of information is exchanged between two speakers. And then he's saying it's at the opposite end of the explicitness continuum from interpersonal talk, which is more interpersonal oriented. Okay, and when you're designing tasks, according to Yule, the task design principles define these things here: purpose, length of term, objective, topic, and sometimes the forms, the particular forms. So the researchers hope to motivate participants, achieving some involvement and interest in a task, but interestingly, on content that's already known to the researcher, which now allows for analysis of that content as it's expressed. So here the researcher is kind of responsible for motivating participants and also has some knowledge that the participants don't have. Okay, so under these conditions, communication is institutionally inscribed, socioculturally biased. The participants, so both myself, the interviewer, and the learners, participants, are trying to establish intersubjectivity to determine what is this interaction going to entail. So it's not just about the referential information exchanged. A definition of agency is the capacity for human beings to alter social structures. So in the context of this, of a referential communication task sequence, we've got kind of the structure of the context of myself and the participants. In the context of I'm a researcher, you're a study participant, I'm in some ways the expert and you're the learner. The participants and the agents involved are acting against three sources of constraint according to Giddens. Ability, sanctions by others, and structural context. Cited by Al-Huri, 2014. Okay. So in SLA, context matters, and we're looking at acquisition, I believe I had marked this one to be, no. So just a little bit of background. We're going to flip through some of the lit review, but making the point that rather than just focusing on underlying grammatical competence, as some of the innatist theorists do, that like the interlanguage variationists have demonstrated, context is really important in how we acquire language. It affects how we use language and ultimately how language is acquired. Tyrone summarized some of the early studies on IL variation. Beebe's study on interlocutor ethnicity and task type and how that influences phonology was another important earlier study. I bring up speech accommodation theory because it's an important idea within this study as well. So Beebe and Giles in '84. There's systematic variation when learners are adjusting to different interactional contexts. And the idea of convergence. So convergence is linguistic and social convergence when social approval is desired and when you want there to be, when you want communicational efficiency to be a high level of that, right? You're really, the exchange is very tightly knit and you're hoping for a very efficient exchange of information. But all of this depends on the speaker's repertoires because you can only converge as much as the speaker's repertoires allow to some extent. Okay. Another study on audience design, and again, this idea of convergence is that style shifts are a process of audience design. So sometimes there's an initiative shift when the speaker wants to kind of differentiate themselves from the addressee. So all of this is leading to our roles in an interaction and raises questions about how language is acquired in a certain context. Okay. I mentioned Coughlin and Duff earlier. Not to go into a lot of detail, but the study itself was about adult learners that were doing a similar description task. And Coughlin and Duff found that the interactional roles were more complex than just novice, expert, subject, researcher, that there was some pushback against these roles with the participants. So the subjects in the study were, as one example, were displaying their cultural knowledge that the interviewer didn't have, thereby like repositioning themselves in the activity. Bringing up some movies, Michael Jackson, this was in '94, right, so that was a more timely reference. And the subjects were seeking more communicative opportunities because there really wasn't much in this task that necessitated communication. It was just, here's a picture, describe the picture. It was more of a linguistic exercise. Okay. One more study that belongs in this category, Casper. And if there are any German speakers out there, perhaps you could help me out. Conversation for learning in German. Anybody? Gesprachsstunde? I don't know. So this was the context. It was a in a foreign language, German foreign language study. And this on interaction between a novice German learner and a fluent bilingual. And again, it was the participants were taking up different roles in the interaction. Expert novice, peer, fluent bilingual, interactional manager. All of these came up at different times and for different reasons. Great. So all of this, in my research question for the study was how do the participants shape the interaction in a question and retell referential task sequence? I want to know what are they doing to challenge the roles that they've been ascribed? What are they doing linguistically how are they engaging in the task? How are they demonstrating agency through the questions they ask and through language they adopt? So these are the tools that I'm using. The methodology is it's a qualitative linguistic analysis of the form and function of questions and adoption of language, similarity of language, patterns that we're seeing there. So it's examining agency in terms of, if you want to say, a typical performance or an idealized performance through strategic behavior and cooperation or maybe resistance. Okay, are there any questions so far up to this point about methodology or the purpose or how the study was framed?
I might have missed exactly what the task was. I mean, I know it involves a picture and involves a
Yep.
Who was looking at what and what was it?
Great. So the task was, I brought some very low-tech visual support here. Right, so it was a series of pictures. I believe there were 7. And so, of course, I was familiar with the story. It had been told to me in my SLA class. I guess you could make up your own version, but so showing the pictures, the participants had to ask questions to find out what's going on in the story. So it's a little girl who she's in trouble through her mother.
So
Yeah.
it wasn't assumed that seeing the pictures actually told them the story.
It wasn't assumed that the pictures told the story.
It was assumed that they didn't.
It was assumed that in the retelling that they would need linguistic input to be able to accurately retell the story, right?
Were they told to retell it, or were they told to ask questions?
They were told to ask questions so that they could retell the story.
Okay, so it's like before retelling.
Yep, that's right. And so this is I think it's a fairly common SLA activity, but it's not without some, there are some merits to it, but also there's some problems which we might see later with the task design. We can talk about task design in a bit. Does that answer your question, Eric? Sure. So let's talk about the participants, including myself as the researcher. So the learner participants, here's a short profile about the 2 learner participants. Roy, he's a graduate student, or was at the time, in psychology. Both of my participants happen to be Korean, from South Korea. Roy's from Gwangju. One thing that I apologize, I forgot to mention, very important to the study, is that they were coming in to see me as a tutor, as I was their tutor, through a service called Student English Language Support. So before the study went underway, they were coming in to work on their oral proficiency and work on, they both had goals to improve their spoken English. So Roy had been in for 10 ESL consultations. Eunji was in her 3rd year in retail merchandising in the School of Design from Gangnam, and she had been in for 4 consultations. Some further data on the participants here. Some interesting notes. So Roy had kind of a more complex upbringing. He had been born in Illinois, but grew up mostly in Korea. Studied in hagwons, which are the private language academies. Well, it could be for other things too, as like math, but he studied English in hagwons. As happens to a lot of people who study English in hagwons, he didn't like English very much because it's not always the most engaging place to learn. And he returned to Illinois to complete high school. He did his undergraduate here, and then he completed his military service in Korea before coming back for graduate school. Eunji grew up in Gangnam, and she actually studied in Georgia, in a public university in Georgia. And there she really enjoyed working with a pronunciation coach. Her goals were to travel extensively in her career. In the future, she saw herself traveling and needing English for that, for communication in a global economy. She loves reading. She loves Harry Potter. And she's sorry that she doesn't have more foreigner friends. She has very few foreigner friends in Minnesota. So the collection was simple. The task was recorded after a consultation. I made arrangements and said, hey, could you, first of all, would you agree to be in my study? After you come in for your ESL consultation, sometime could you stick around and do a task for me so I can look at, we can learn about learner language, or learn about your language through the task. It was recorded on GarageBand, right? I looped it back so I could try to transcribe everything as best I could. And then the purpose of this initial study was for, like I said, for the SLA course, so learner language course that was taught by Professor Tyrone. Okay. So I did this. I transcribed what I heard. And this, my method for doing this was, it's not phonological, so I'm transcribing it into spoken English into written English, marking things like a question mark with rising intonation, punctuation-wise. So there's some imperfection in the method, but I tried to represent what I heard as best as I could. Okay. Analysis was through questions, so I looked at form and functions using the taxonomy of question functions from Kearsley, looking at all the different ways that questions are used. So they're usually intended to elicit a response, but not always, as we know. Questions can have lots of different functions. This is a rundown of some of those. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these types of questions, right? Echoic questions, epistemic, expressive, social control. So if I'm looking at questions and I see anything that's not necessarily geared towards just referential communication, acquiring information, I'm interested in that. The other thing is this idea of convergence or divergence. So I'm looking for patterns and parallel phrases. So the idea is if it's a high degree of similarity, there might be convergence occurring, which could be a number of things. It could be that the participant and myself as the researcher are really converging. Perhaps there's we want the exchange to be really efficient, or maybe it's based on identity and there's a social element to that, like I identify with you, so I'm going to use language that's similar. Maybe it's out of necessity because you're the only source right here of input. Or divergence could be the opposite. I don't identify with you, or this, I'm thinking of another model, another speech model. So now I'd like to talk about the results. So the handout that you have, on one side you've got Roy, and on the other side you've got Inji. So you might have to flip back and forth. Odd is Roy, and even is Inji. Roy's questioning strategy. Looking at example 1, and the underlined part is Roy, right? And the arrows there, they are marking questions of interest, particular areas of interest. So in this example, Roy starts out with a WH question to try to understand the conflict. If you look at my response, I'm pretty evasive in that I'm not giving direct, explicit information, right? And that, of course, that's my strategy because I don't want to just describe the picture for the participant. I want the participant to ask me a lot of questions. So I'm somewhat evasive. Roy's trying different questions to get more precise information. Line 6, 10, right? He's really trying a lot of different kinds of questions. And I consistently use something. The little girl is trying to say that the cat did something in lines 14, 15. Lines 10, 11, she's angry because of something that happened to the cake. So this is This is the cue. Please ask more questions. I'm not going to give it away. And you see Roy's question here doesn't get, on line 20 through 22, doesn't quite get the response, the explicit response that he's looking for. So there's kind of this play, this interaction of, hey, that's a pretty good question, but I'm going to always sort of leave something out so that it leads to another question. And then tabling all of the questions and kind of looking at it together. In this table, I've got a reformulated question underneath what the speaker participant said. And then I've categorized by function and the response that occurred. So in summarizing that, Roy asked 21 questions, 6 WH, 15 yes, no. Most questions are about the setting, about the referential information, the action characters. Roy is concerned about vocabulary. How do you call this part of the apartment she was stepping on, right? And then he says, ledge, he's confirming what he hears. I say ledge, he says ledge. He wants to make sure he gets this right. Roy prefers uninverted yes-no questions, like, let's see, an example, what is that there? So, so she's trying to follow her cat, right? In other words, Roy is, an inverted question would be, is she trying to follow her cat? He's not sure if that's what's happening. Here he's just saying, so she's trying to follow her cat. A different form, perhaps a different function. Unji's questioning strategy. She starts out like Roy, asking a WH question. I use something, again, to get Unji to ask another question, and she does. And then I evade again, or I give an incomplete answer, and then Unji sort of hesitates, and then I ask, so do you want to ask anything else? I use a question to get her to produce another. So Unji moves on to, today is her birthday? And it's an interesting question here. Instead of moving on to what she did and trying to find out what, right, exactly what happened, all I said was the mother thinks she did something naughty. She didn't say, oh, so she ate the cake, or she says, today is her birthday? So kind of moving on to a different idea, a different question. And then she gives her interpretation. She says, I think the reason the mother angry is that she ate this cake. And I said, oh, yeah, you got it, right? Similarly, I compiled the table. So here, Unji asks 18 questions. She asks 8 WH questions and 10 yes-no questions. Okay. Majority of questions, again, just like Roy, about what's going on in the story. But there's 2 procedural questions. And can I go next? That's it. And 2 expressive questions. He's guys? And where's the cake? Expressive, because, and we'll look at this later, but because of what's going on, I don't think it's necessarily about acquiring the correct information. It's more here to display some humor. And he's guys is about, there's a character that's drawn here, and it's kind of scribbly. I think because of where, got it upside down. Because of the way that the artist portrayed the scene, these guys. I mean, if you're looking at it from a distance, it's just, okay. I said he's calling 911. She's just surprised. Oh, you mean he's a guy? I didn't know that, right? Just kind of more expressive, more for engagement, perhaps. She uses a lot of WH questions, which are more open-ended in that sense, that I can reply in a variety of ways rather than yes, no. The phrases, Moving on to the parallel phrases. So with Roy, I'm noting the similarity here. The boldface is similarity. Italics means there's something different there. So in these examples here, we're seeing there's a high degree of similarity in the linguistic elements in the form, with some exception. High degree of similarity, minor divergences. I mean, these are explained by just the fact that sometimes the prepositions don't matter as much. I mean, they're not as essential, right? They tend to be the less things we acquire in language, more difficult things. Telling versus asking, that's kind of interesting. There are some divergences here that are worth discussion. As either participant is not going to just parrot the language, they're going to take elements and make use of the language that is provided. Unji's table here shows, I'm trying to find parallel phrases. I'm trying to find more convergence. And I'm seeing more that the language is built up, it's co-constructed over time. There are some examples. For example, 3 here, it seems quite similar. And so line 26 to 84, this is from the question phase to the retell phase. It's quite a bit later on. There's a lot of similarity in those phrases. Fewer instances of parallel phrases. Co-construction is occurring. Unji's combining forms to create new language. And then, as I pointed out, example 3 was a pretty good example of a parallel phrase with some differences in the marking of the verb tense. This is interesting that Unji often sticks with language that she initiates, even though I provide some other language. Sometimes she goes back to those forms. Oops. Okay. So beyond just like the phrases, there's also something interesting here with stylistic features. So you're kind of latching on to some elements. Roy says trying to a lot. I say it, and then Roy starts saying it. I don't know if that means he's picked it up from me or if we just have a similar way of speaking, right? But when we use trying to, we're not showing our certainty about something. We're showing possibility. We're showing maybe that there's some obstacle in the way, or some question as to whether it's going to occur or not. So I use it twice. Roy starts saying it all over the place. He says it in line 17, 14, 19. Even here, it's what does this picture try to say, right? For Unji, it's more the feature that I found that jumped out was this quotatives and constructed dialogue. So when you're representing the thoughts of characters, or you're trying to demonstrate what they're thinking, or maybe characterize them, we can use this quotative constructed dialogue strategy. So I say, she thinks I'm going to go out. I found this really fascinating. So the window's open and she thinks, I'm going to go out. And then later on this happens. Unji says, she thinks, it is not, I'm sorry. She thinks, it is a good idea to change my mind. So just that the little girl thinks something and we're gonna verbalize what the little girl is thinking. So after I use it once, Unji, when she retells, she's using this strategy a lot. She gets a lot of mileage out of the strategy. And it occurs in the same place, so I think there's something going on with that. So there's some, we're going to skip this for time, but with some particular vocabulary as well. We can see Roy picks up ledge, Unji picks up board. Okay, we'll leave that kind of out. So it brings us to the discussion of what's going on here. Okay. So based on these results, we can see that there are some possible explanations for the results. One would be just comparing proficiency, that Roy's proficiency is a bit higher than Unji's. This was confirmed by, not confirmed, but a colleague gave her an independent analysis of their data and said, yeah, I would rate Roy's proficiency at intermediate low. She's an ACTFL OPI rater. She worked with the same data that I have, so it's not perfect, but unfortunately there were no TOEFL scores there was no objective measure otherwise of proficiency. But that's one factor. Another would be, do you identify with the interviewer? So do you not? To what degree? Do you want to be referentially precise? Or just tell a good story? So I've kind of contrasted the two learners in that sense. Referential precision seems to be what Roy's going for, not so much what Unji's going for. With all of the constructed dialogue, she's just telling the story as she sees it, and in some ways embellishing. Roy's negotiate a bit more than Unji, who is more reactive, and this was again noticed by my colleague. So some differences in what occurs. This is interesting. Roy, this is an example of Roy's bid for a linguistic uptake upgrade. I believe here what's happened is I've sort of used some foreigner talk. I would say I've been guilty sometimes of using foreigner talk. She feels a little bit bad for her behavior, and also because she was so scared up there, right? And here he kind of, I think quite upset is more of an upgrade than so scared. Just a different choice there. I believe Roy's bidding for, hey, let's use some more academic language or some more formal language. In other words, this isn't quite the level of language I want to work with. Unji's joke, where's the cake, right? And the reason why this is so hilarious for me is because she's right, there's no cake. I mean, the story began with a cake. The mother left to get the cake, and so part of if we're talking about the story itself, and then we look at the last frame, and there is no cake. So what happened to the cake, right? For me, this demonstrates, this is kind of a repositioning. Unji's repositioning herself in the activity. It's not about how I'm the English learner here, and I'm going to go through this exercise. It's like, I noticed something valuable. I noticed some information that slipped by. It might have slipped by you, right? I don't know. Is it a social thing? Is it to create like a lighter atmosphere? Or is it like self-amusement and just kind of more of an ironic stance? Like, where's the cake? The story ends and there's no cake. I found that very interesting. So in my conclusion, I found, to answer these questions, that the participants use questions to find their own way to engage in the task. I mean, there was referential information exchanged, and in many ways it was similar, but there were some differences in how they engaged in the task. In both of those examples, both Roy's and Unji's, I believe that they're challenging kind of the role that they've been put in, and whether through a bid for like a linguistic upgrade or maybe just by creating a more humorous social context. And the adopted language too. So it facilitates communication if we use similar language, right? It's a learning opportunity if you see the interaction as a place where you can acquire language. And maybe it's also a place to demonstrate your competence in the language or to kind of display it. It can also be signaling autonomy if you diverge from the interlocutor. So identifying with the interlocutor or not. And sometimes what I saw with this was that for Roy, I believe that there were, if we just look at who the people are in this, who the participant is and the researcher, there's good reason to believe that Roy might identify with me more easily than Unji would for a host of reasons. Age, sex, perhaps just interest.
You had 10 consultations with you, so it's kind of a fan.
And there you go, yeah.
She went before.
And that's worth pointing out, thank you, yeah. I think so, we had better rapport maybe at that time, right? Okay, huge limitations for the study. Task design for one, if the learner is going to ask me questions, but I already know the story, and in fact, in the pictures, I mean, you could probably tell me the story just by looking at the pictures. You could invent a story. So is it really necessary to be referentially precise to get the story correct? So it tends to lead into a linguistic exercise. Agency is just difficult. I mean, I picked a huge topic that's, I'll admit, it's got some shortcomings. It's hard to examine through just this kind of linguistic data. And I've thrown in quite a few of my own interpretations of what's going on, right? Which is kind of inevitable when we're talking about this topic, but I would be interested in knowing how I could do such a study and just have it be more grounded, I think, in research, past research. So, also the language adopted, is it linguistic priming? Is it just that it's there and we're going to use it? Or is it audience design, that it's intentional because of you're trying to appeal to your interlocutor? Okay. All right. I would like to first invite any questions to this point. I know we're probably within 5 minutes we'll have to wrap up, but does anybody have any questions about the study that I presented? Yes?
Just wondering if you consider gender differences at all. I was thinking about that table that you gave that sort of summarized the results for the two participants, and I wondered if the way that they manage those interactions could have been gender determined, since you have one male and one female participant.
Right.
And I don't know anything about Korean culture, but I wonder what the cultural roles are for men and women that might have influenced that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that if it wasn't in my table, it should have been. It could play a huge role. I believe did play a huge role in what resulted in those interactions. For example, the questions that are about procedural questions, can I go next? Is that it? It's kind of like putting me more in the driver's seat of the activity. So I can't speak to Korean culture on a broad level like that, but I do think there was something at play there that's worth thinking about. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Did you consider delaying your graduation by a few years and following up? By engaging a Korean to interview each of those people and view the tapes and the transcripts and just talk about what was in their minds?
Yeah. No, I actually thought about that. For exactly 2 more years might be the time frame we're looking at. But so the danger of this study is that I'm trying to represent what's going on in the social minds of my participants, and I don't know. And at some point you have to just, I believe that like a stimulated recall kind of exercise could be really fascinating. An interview, let's learn from this together. I think that would be a great exercise too. But even with that, you would have what's on the surface, and then you would have another layer underneath that of social interaction. So it could just continue ad infinitum, right? But great idea. I think that would be worthwhile. Yep. David?
So you said that you didn't have more like quantifiable data on your proficiency.
Yeah.
Right? But they were both admitted, right?
They were both admitted,
no
yeah.
their minimum TOEFL or equivalent.
That's true.
Right, a third did.
That's true.
It seems like their oral proficiency is lower compared to what their overall English proficiency must be.
Right.
If they're admitted.
Right.
Do you think that has any bearing on how they performed, or like,
Yeah,
their other skills, basically?
sure. I imagine that perhaps they're stronger in reading and writing, right? Yeah, and I think for someone like Unji, the social element, you could see that in her goals. It was sort of like she needs more language. She would like to have, through the consultations, more opportunities to refine her oral language. And for Roy too. I see it as he's going for academic English in a sort of semi-professional graduate student in psychology way, and Unji's maybe lacks at a more fundamental level, just more social English, more just not baseline proficiency, but just easier communication with people. So, yeah, I don't know if I hinted at answering your question there, or yeah.
Okay. They have certain goals related to speaking, probably.
Right.
Not sort of the same.
Right. Yeah. Very good. So that probably means it's 10:10. If I know David, right, it's going to go off at just the right time. I'm really sorry. This didn't really lead to the kind of discussion that I hoped for, although this part is really fascinating, and your questions regarding what I presented are, I really welcome that. What'd you say, Eric?
You want us to get rowdy or something?
No, not at all. What I was saying is that, so I had kind of further questions based on, for pedagogy, and just considering my audience is primarily, we are teachers of language, so we didn't get to that discussion as much, but I'd be happy to have it.
I take it the CARLA site is full of things like that teachers can grab and use copyright free, right?
The question and retell?
Yeah, the images.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're up there.
There are a few.
It's very promising.
Mhm.
Yeah, those are part of the learner language
Yeah.
site. That's what Elaine used for a lot of the tasks that she set up with the learners.
I would like to set up a task that uses pictures like that, but I want to test their understanding of past tense. The problem with pictures is that present tense is always fine. It's a little bit, I almost need a video of an actual event, I guess. And it can't even be a video of a movie, because that's also a work of art that exists when you describe the present tense. So,
That was going to be one of my questions, is how do you make, how do you, a task like this, you're aiming for a certain, you're expecting maybe the past tense, or you're expecting a certain linguistic form, and
I know that's what I want, but
Right.
I know I can't get it through pictures if native speakers don't even use past tense to talk about pictures. That's the issue.
Right.
So,
And the whole issue of question forms here was that Roy is just telling us what he sees with an uninverted yes/no question, and so that's a strategy that I'm sure any of us would use. So it's hard to say, well, is it strategic behavior, or is that he hasn't acquired that form, so he's going to avoid it, or maybe some combination.
I thought it was just interesting that you have people, the task itself, you're telling the story, and one is choosing to make a play out of it.
Yes.
And thinking of all these different things. It's just a different way of telling a story.
Right.
And it almost seemed like, I don't know if the directions were a little different, or it's just that's how they would want to tell a story.
Right.
And to have them be more parallel, to have directions that say, we'd like you to tell a story, without having those sort of thought bubbles.
Yeah,
Or,
yeah.
just, tell it as you might write it.
Sure.
the storytelling part is a good strategy, though.
It
makes
is.
easy. So
Yeah.
I did this kind of thing in Monday in my class. And to my surprise, I overheard a student talking about John. And there were no names in these things. Instead of having to say the boy or a boy, you just gave him a name so they could refer to him as John.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah. Yeah, very good.
Storytelling art is way easier to understand. I used to do it with picture series where basically the story is the guy is digging in his backyard and he finds something, turns out to be a valuable vase, but he doesn't know what it is until he goes to an expert. He gets a lot of money for it. But anyway, lower level learners would say things like, and he finds in his backyard, he finds something. Oh, what's this?
Right.
It's clear enough, but it's really a beginner's strategy. Obviously.
Very good. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for your time. I'd like to thank the CARLA staff, Dr. Paisani, Karen, Marlene, thank you. And thanks to all my MELP colleagues. I know we've got to get off to class, so let's go.
Including you.
Yeah.